Creek looked perfect from the outside. Nestled between forest-covered mountains, the town seemed frozen in a postcard of suburban tranquility. The Reynolds family's moving truck rumbled down Maple Drive, its tires crunching the gravel with an almost deafening finality in the eerie morning silence. Marcus Reynolds gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the synthetic leather. The promotion at the tech company had been a dream come true, a chance to leave the suffocating weight of their past behind. Yet, an unshakable sense of unease had followed him from the moment they set out. Beside him, Elena sat rigid, her eyes darting over the meticulously maintained houses lining the street. Each lawn was a perfect rectangle of emerald grass, each mailbox gleaming under the morning sun. Yet, something about their uniformity felt off. In the back seat, Caleb and Arya were opposites in their reaction to the move. Caleb, 16, with his lanky frame and perpetually furrowed brow, stared silently out the window, absorbing the unfamiliar world like a sponge. 12-year-old Arya, however, had already checked out, her headphones shielding her from the reality of their new home as her fingers danced across the screen of her tablet. Their new house sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, a modern architectural marvel of glass and stone that looked like it belonged on the cover of a luxury living magazine. As Marcus steered the truck into the driveway, his gaze was drawn to the neighboring house. It was a stark contrast, a Victorian-style home, its once white paint now cracked and peeling, its windows dark and vacant. Yet, as he stared, he felt an irrational certainty that those windows were watching him, not reflecting the world, but observing it. "We're here," Marcus said, forcing a smile into his voice. No one responded. The unpacking was a tedious affair, each box carried into the pristine house feeling heavier than the last. Caleb worked with an efficiency that bordered on unnatural, his movements deliberate and purposeful. Elena watched him, frowning as she noticed how he would pause every so often, tilting his head as if listening for a sound only he could hear. By mid-afternoon, the silence of the cul-de-sac was broken by a sharp knock on the door. Marcus opened it to reveal a woman in her mid-40s, her floral print dress clinging to an outdated aesthetic. Her smile stretched too wide, her eyes devoid of the warmth her expression seemed to promise. "Welcome to Willow Creek," she said, her voice honeyed but carrying an undertone that made Marcus's skin crawl. "I'm Margaret Thompson. I live across the street." Behind her, a teenage boy hovered in the shadows of the porch. Tyler Thompson was painfully thin, his pale skin almost translucent, his dark eyes unnervingly large. He stood still, too still, as though the act of breathing itself was a chore. Margaret gestured toward him. "This is my son, Tyler. He's about Caleb's age." Her gaze flicked to Caleb, who had appeared silently behind Marcus. When Tyler's eyes met Caleb's, the air seemed to shift. Something unspoken and ancient passed between them, and Marcus felt a chill race down his spine. "We're having a neighborhood gathering this weekend," Margaret continued. Her tone was light, but the statement bore the weight of a command. "You'll join us, of course." It wasn't a question. That night, as darkness enveloped Willow Creek, the house seemed to hold its breath. Caleb stood at his bedroom window, staring out at the street below. The silence outside was unnatural. No dogs barked. No laughter echoed. Just an oppressive stillness that pressed against the glass. Movement across the street drew his attention. Tyler Thompson stood in his own window, illuminated by a single flickering lamp. He was staring directly at Caleb. His face betrayed no emotion, his body unnervingly motionless. Caleb didn't flinch. Instead, a slow, unsettling smile spread across his lips, a smile that did not belong to a 16-year-old boy. Back at the Reynolds house, the unease was palpable. Elena tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in her chest as she unpacked dishes in the kitchen. Caleb's behavior had grown increasingly peculiar. He moved through the house as if he knew it better than anyone else, his steps confident and purposeful. Occasionally, she would catch him muttering under his breath, the words unintelligible but rhythmic, like a chant. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Arya's screams shattered the fragile calm. Marcus and Elena raced to her room, finding her curled into a ball on her bed, her tablet discarded on the floor. "There was a face," she sobbed. "In my screen. It was watching me." Marcus picked up the tablet, its screen black. He pressed the power button, but it wouldn't turn on. He glanced at Elena, whose face was pale with worry. "It's just her imagination," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. That night, Marcus barely slept. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of their room, and the sound of footsteps echoed faintly in the halls. Each time he rose to investigate, he found nothing. But the feeling of being watched never left him. Across the street, the Victorian house loomed in the darkness, its windows glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Caleb stood at his window again, his gaze fixed on it. As he watched, the front door creaked open, and a figure stepped out. Tyler Thompson. He stood on the porch, his head tilted unnaturally, as if listening. Slowly, he raised a hand and beckoned. Caleb's lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear. Then, without hesitation, he turned from the window and slipped out of his room. Marcus woke to the sound of the front door clicking shut. Racing down the stairs, he caught a glimpse of Caleb disappearing into the night. He called after him, his voice trembling with fear, but Caleb didn't stop. The perfect facade of Willow Creek was beginning to crack. The Reynolds family had moved into something far more sinister than they could have imagined, and it was only just beginning. The school bus stop was a battleground of unspoken tensions. Caleb Reynolds stood slightly apart from the cluster of students, his presence exuding a quiet, unsettling dominance. The morning fog coiled around the group, muffling sounds and casting shifting shadows that danced just out of focus. Everything felt damp, heavy, and unreal, as if the world itself was holding its breath. From the mist, Derek Rodriguez emerged, his swagger amplified by the two boys flanking him. Derek wasn't physically imposing, but his reputation for ruthlessness preceded him. Troy, broad-shouldered and brutish, loomed on Derek's right, his hands curling into fists. Keith, wiry and quick, stayed just behind, his movements like a predator's poised to strike. Together, they moved as a unit, exuding the kind of confidence that came from years of unchecked power. "Hey, new kid," Derek called, his voice cutting through the muted morning like a blade. Caleb turned slowly, his eyes meeting Derek's with an unnerving stillness. The tension was palpable. Around them, the other students began to drift away, their murmurs fading into the mist. They knew what was coming and wanted no part of it. Derek took a step closer, pulling a hunting knife from his jacket. The blade gleamed dully, its edge sharp enough to promise blood. "We have a tradition here in Willow Creek," Derek sneered. "We make sure new kids know their place." Caleb's expression didn't change. He stood rooted, unflinching, his silence more menacing than any threat. Something in his gaze made Troy and Keith hesitate, their confidence faltering. But Derek was undeterred. He lunged. What happened next unfolded with a swiftness that defied explanation. Caleb's hand shot out, intercepting Derek's knife-wielding arm. The movement was precise, mechanical, as if Caleb had rehearsed it 1,000 times. In one fluid motion, he twisted Derek's wrist, the sound of cracking bone echoing in the still air. Derek screamed, the knife clattering to the ground. Troy reacted instinctively, charging forward with brute force. Caleb pivoted, his elbow striking Troy's throat with surgical precision. Troy collapsed, gasping for air. Keith fumbled for a knife of his own, but Caleb was faster. Before Keith could fully draw the blade, Caleb disarmed him, slamming him against the metal bus stop shelter with a force that rattled the structure. Keith's head hit the frame with a sickening thud, and he slid to the ground, unconscious. It was over in seconds. The three boys lay broken, their bodies a testament to Caleb's unearthly precision. He stood in the center of the chaos, untouched, his breathing steady, his face devoid of emotion. The bus pulled up moments later, its brakes hissing. Without a word, Caleb stepped over the fallen boys and boarded, taking a seat near the back. The other students, those who had dared to remain within sight, watched in stunned silence. By lunchtime, the school was abuzz with rumors. Derek Rodriguez, the school's unofficial enforcer, was in the hospital with a shattered arm. Troy's throat injury required emergency surgery. Keith was nursing a severe concussion and multiple fractures. No one could agree on the exact details of what had happened, but one thing was clear, Caleb Reynolds was no ordinary teenager. In the cafeteria, Caleb sat alone, eating his lunch with an eerie calm. Students whispered in hushed tones, their gazes flicking toward him before quickly looking away. Fear clung to them like a second skin, but there was something else beneath it, a dark, almost reverent awe. The school administration acted quickly. Statements were taken, and witnesses were questioned, though their accounts were fractured and contradictory. Some described Caleb as a blur of motion, moving faster than seemed humanly possible. Others swore they heard him whispering in a language they couldn't understand. By the end of the day, Caleb's parents were summoned to the principal's office. Marcus and Elena sat across from Principal Greaves, a severe woman whose icy demeanor matched her piercing gaze. "Your son will face immediate disciplinary action," Greaves said, her voice cold and matter-of-fact. "The evidence is undeniable. He's a danger to other students. He'll be transferred to a juvenile detention center pending further investigation." Marcus protested, his voice rising with desperation. "This has to be a mistake. Caleb isn't violent. He's never been in trouble before." Elena remained silent, her eyes fixed on Caleb. He sat beside her, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. She'd noticed the changes in him over the past few days, the way he moved with unnatural grace, the way his eyes seemed to pierce through people. She didn't recognize him anymore. His eyes no longer looked human. That night, Caleb was processed for transfer. As the paperwork was finalized, a storm rolled into Willow Creek. Rain lashed against the windows of the police station, and thunder growled in the distance. Caleb sat in a holding cell, his hands resting loosely on his knees. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting shifting shadows on the walls. Officer Hughes, the man assigned to transport Caleb, leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee. He'd been a cop in Willow Creek for over a decade, and something about this case gnawed at him. The kid wasn't acting like someone who just brutalized 3 classmates. He wasn't scared or angry. He was calm. Too calm. "Creepy little bastard," Hughes muttered under his breath. At precisely midnight, the power went out. The station was plunged into darkness, and the rain outside intensified, hammering against the building. Hughes cursed, fumbling for a flashlight. The backup generator hummed to life, but the lights remained dim and unsteady. When Hughes reached Caleb's cell, it was empty. The door hung open, the lock twisted and mangled as if torn apart by sheer force. A low, guttural sound echoed through the station, a noise that wasn't quite human. Panic surged through Hughes as he drew his weapon. He moved cautiously through the station, his flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The sound came again, closer this time. It was a wet, guttural noise that sent shivers racing down his spine. In the lobby, the glass door shattered inward, scattering shards across the tile floor. The rain poured in, carried by a fierce wind. Hughes turned toward the noise, his heart hammering in his chest. "Caleb," he called, his voice trembling. A figure stepped into the faint light. It was Caleb, but not as Hughes had last seen him. His posture was predatory, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. There was something primal, something ancient in his movements. "What are you?" Hughes whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. Caleb smiled, a slow, chilling expression that revealed too many teeth. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice low and resonant, carrying a weight that felt inhuman. And then he was gone, disappearing into the storm as if he'd never been there at all. Tyler Thompson's birthday wasn't just a celebration. It was an event steeped in tradition, an unspoken ritual cloaked in suburban normalcy. The backyard, framed by a white picket fence, was a scene out of a catalog, balloons tied in perfect symmetry, tables adorned with vibrant centerpieces, and parents who smiled with the stiffness of mannequins. Every detail seemed to shout perfection, but beneath the surface, something darker pulsed. Marcus and Elena Reynolds arrived with Caleb, the silence between them heavy. Caleb had been released from juvenile detention just days prior under circumstances that baffled the family. The school administration had dropped the charges without explanation, and the few questions Marcus dared to ask were met with stonewalling indifference. Caleb, however, seemed unaffected. His gaze remained distant, his presence unnervingly calm, like the eye of a storm. Across the yard, Tyler stood by his parents, his lanky frame casting a long shadow in the late afternoon sun. His eyes locked onto Caleb's, a subtle acknowledgement passing between them. They hadn't spoken since the Reynolds family moved to Willow Creek, yet an unspoken bond, dark and inescapable, tied them together. The children at the party were engrossed in elaborate games. Toy guns clicked, and plastic swords clashed in mock battles. The laughter, though bright, had an eerie edge, as if the games mirrored something far more sinister. The adults mingled at the fringes, their conversations muted but charged with a tension that hinted at secrets too dangerous to voice. The atmosphere shifted when Derek Rodriguez and his cronies appeared. The trio sauntered into the yard, their presence like a dark cloud blotting out the artificial cheer. Derek's wrist was still in a cast, a bitter souvenir of his last encounter with Caleb. Troy and Keith flanked him, their smirks cruel and their eyes gleaming with barely restrained malice. They hadn't been invited, an oversight they clearly intended to rectify. Derek's voice cut through the revelry like a knife. "Hey, Jeff," he sneered, deliberately using the wrong name. "We've got unfinished business." The yard fell silent. Children stopped mid-play. Adults froze mid-sentence. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. Caleb turned slowly, his movements deliberate, his expression unreadable. "Leave," Marcus said, stepping forward. His voice was firm but edged with unease. Derek ignored him, his focus locked solely on Caleb. "What? Too scared to finish what you started?" Derek taunted. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a knife, its blade glinting wickedly in the fading sunlight. The tension snapped taut, the world narrowing to the space between Caleb and his aggressors. Caleb didn't answer. He didn't flinch. He simply waited. Derek lunged. The ensuing chaos unfolded with brutal precision. Caleb moved like a predator, his reflexes faster than the human eye could follow. He caught Derek's knife hand mid-thrust, twisting it with a sickening crack. Derek screamed as the blade clattered to the ground. Troy and Keith reacted instantly, pulling small, rusted pistols from their pockets. "Nobody move!" Troy shouted, his voice cracking with adrenaline. The parents didn't scream. The children didn't cry. They stood like statues, their faces eerily blank. Caleb's smile spread slowly, chillingly. In one fluid motion, he closed the distance between himself and Troy. A sharp elbow to the throat sent the boy crumpling, his gun skittering across the patio. Keith aimed his weapon, but Caleb was faster. He disarmed him with a savage twist of his arm, followed by a kick that sent Keith sprawling into the dessert table. "Stop this!" Marcus shouted, rushing forward, but Elena grabbed his arm. Her grip was ironclad, her expression unreadable. "Wait," she said softly. Marcus looked at her, horrified. "What do you mean, wait?" "He's—" "Just watch," she interrupted, her voice almost a whisper. In the kitchen, the confrontation reached its crescendo. Keith, desperate and trembling, grabbed a vodka bottle from the counter and smashed it over Caleb's head. The sharp crack echoed through the house. Blood and glass rained down, yet Caleb barely flinched. "Fight me!" Keith screamed, his voice hoarse and panicked. Caleb's smile deepened. It was a smile that no longer belonged to a 16-year-old boy. He grabbed a nearby towel rack and wielded it like a weapon, striking with unrelenting precision. Keith's screams were cut short as Caleb delivered the final blow, sending him crumpling to the floor. The smell of bleach filled the air. Flames danced in the reflection of Caleb's darkened eyes. By the time the parents entered the house, it was over. The bodies of Derek, Troy, and Keith lay still, broken like discarded toys. "What have you done?" Marcus demanded, his voice trembling. Caleb turned to face him, his face spattered with blood, his smile eerily calm. "What needed to be done," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. In that moment, Marcus saw it. Caleb's eyes, ringed with an unnatural darkness, were not his own. Something ancient, something malevolent, had taken root in his son. The party guests began to disperse, their faces eerily calm despite the carnage. Parents ushered their children away without a word, their movements mechanical, their expressions void of emotion. Tyler stood at the edge of the yard, watching Caleb with a knowing look. "It started," Tyler said softly, almost to himself. Elena placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, her gaze fixed on Caleb. "We're not in control anymore," she said, her voice heavy with resignation. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the yard in shadows. The birthday balloons swayed in the breeze, their vibrant colors now muted against the darkening sky. In the distance, the faint sound of sirens grew louder, but Marcus knew they were too late. Whatever had awakened in Willow Creek had already taken hold. And it was only just beginning. The hospital room was sterile, but something dark lingered between its white walls. A faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a sound almost drowned out by the rhythmic beeping of machines. Yet, to those who entered, the air felt thick, oppressive, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Caleb's body was a canvas of destruction. Burns covered over 60% of his skin, leaving a patchwork of angry red flesh and blackened tissue. The doctors had done all they could, but grafts wouldn't take. His body rejected them, almost as though it had other plans. Healing seemed impossible. And yet, beneath the surface, something was shifting, changing. The whispers began within days. Doctors huddled in corners, their voices low but anxious. Nurses exchanged uneasy glances as they passed his door. His medical charts defied logic, his heart rate, at times, slowed to the brink of death, only to spike moments later with a force that could burst blood vessels. Blood tests revealed anomalies, cellular mutations that no one could explain. Elena sat at his bedside, her hand trembling as it hovered inches above his bandaged form. She couldn't bring herself to touch him, her maternal instincts battling a deep, primal fear. Something was wrong with her son, something far beyond the burns. Her husband Marcus lingered in the doorway, unwilling to step closer. The distance between them was not just physical anymore, it was a chasm of disbelief and terror. The first signs of transformation came subtly. Machines in Caleb's room began to malfunction. Monitors flashed nonsense data before going dark. Temperature controls failed, alternating between freezing cold and stifling heat. Nurses reported watches that stopped functioning as soon as they entered. Some claimed their hair stood on end, as though an invisible static charge permeated the air. On the third day, the bandages came off. What they revealed silenced the room. Caleb's skin had turned a porcelain white, unnervingly smooth and reflective. It looked more like polished marble than flesh. Where burns had once festered, there was now something unnatural, unyielding. His eyes, permanently open, were ringed in an inky darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They locked onto anyone who dared meet his gaze, unblinking, endless. "What happened to my face?" Caleb asked, his voice calm but alien, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. His words hung in the air, unanswered. The doctors exchanged nervous glances, their confidence eroded by what they were witnessing. This wasn't recovery. It was a metamorphosis. Caleb's psychological evaluations revealed more disturbing truths. He spoke of the violence that had led him here with a clinical detachment that unnerved even seasoned interrogators. They needed to be removed, he explained flatly when asked about the events of Tyler Thompson's party. They disrupted the natural order. His voice carried no emotion, only a cold certainty that chilled the room. Tyler visited once, standing awkwardly at the foot of the bed. No words passed between them, but something unspoken filled the space. Their eyes met, and in that instant, a connection sparked, one that transcended language or logic. It was as if they understood each other on a level no one else could fathom. Tyler left without looking back. By the fifth night, strange phenomena began to plague the hospital. Shadows in Caleb's room moved independently of any light source, flickering and twisting unnaturally. Staff reported hearing whispers in languages they didn't recognize, faint and disjointed, but always emanating from his room. Cold spots appeared around his bed, and the air felt heavier, harder to breathe. Marcus tried to rationalize what was happening, but the weight of the truth crushed his attempts. Caleb was becoming something that couldn't be confined by hospital walls or human understanding. Elena, though paralyzed by fear, couldn't abandon her son. She spent every night by his side, her presence more out of duty than hope. On the seventh night, Caleb began to alter himself deliberately. With surgical precision, he carved a smile into his cheeks, extending the corners of his mouth into a grotesque, permanent grin. His movements were steady, methodical, as though guided by an unseen hand. When the night nurse found him, her scream echoed down the sterile hallways. "I can smile forever now," Caleb said softly, his grin fixed in place, his voice devoid of emotion. His gaze followed the nurse as she stumbled out, her terror palpable. His transformation wasn't limited to his appearance. Caleb's presence in the hospital became an infection, spreading fear and chaos. Patients in neighboring rooms grew restless, some claiming they saw him standing at the foot of their beds, even when he hadn't left his own room. Others described nightmares of cold hands and unblinking eyes pulling them into a darkness they couldn't escape. By the eighth day, the hospital staff began resigning en masse. Those who stayed did so out of morbid curiosity or sheer necessity. Caleb's room was declared off limits, but that didn't stop the whispers or the creeping dread that seeped into every corner of the building. That night, the final transformation occurred. Caleb's heart monitor flatlined. The steady, high-pitched tones signaled the end, but no one dared enter the room to confirm. Hours passed before a janitor, compelled by duty and dread, pushed open the door. The room was empty. The machines were silent. The bed sheets were undisturbed, save for a faint imprint where Caleb had once lain. But Caleb hadn't vanished. He had simply left the confines of the hospital. As the janitor turned to flee, he caught sight of a figure in the hallway, tall, pale, and grinning. Caleb stood there, his unblinking eyes locking onto the man. A whisper filled the air, faint but unmistakable. Willow Creek isn't ready. The lights flickered. The shadows danced. And when the janitor turned back, Caleb was gone. The hospital never recovered. Staff left in droves, and patients transferred out as quickly as they could. The building's reputation as a place of healing was replaced by one of fear and whispered legends. Caleb Reynolds had become something beyond human, something ancient and terrifying. And Willow Creek would soon understand what it meant to face him. Darkness swallowed the Reynolds household, its oppressive stillness punctuated only by the faint creak of wood and the rhythmic breathing of those unaware of the nightmare about to unfold. Outside, Willow Creek seemed oblivious, its manicured lawns and pristine homes a stark contrast to the horror brewing within. Caleb moved like a shadow, his steps soundless on the hardwood floors. His skin, unnaturally pale and smooth like polished marble, seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. The perpetual smile carved into his cheeks stretched unnervingly, the dark hollows of his unblinking eyes drinking in the faint glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. A gleaming knife rested in his hand, its blade a sliver of silver that promised violence. The door to his parents' bedroom groaned faintly as it swung open. Marcus stirred, his instincts momentarily rousing him from the depths of sleep. But it was too late. Caleb was already there, moving with the precision of a predator. The first strike was coldly efficient, the blade plunging into Marcus's throat with an almost mechanical detachment. Marcus's eyes snapped open, his body convulsing once before falling still. His gurgling death rattle faded into silence. Elena bolted upright, her scream frozen in her throat by the sight of Caleb's grotesque smile hovering above her. She barely had time to raise her hands in defense before the blade struck again. Caleb's movements were swift and deliberate, his strikes calculated to end her life without unnecessary struggle. Her blood soaked the sheets, pooling in dark crimson rivulets that trickled onto the floor. The house grew deathly silent once more, the gruesome tableau illuminated by the pale light of the moon. Caleb stood over the lifeless forms of his parents, tilting his head as if admiring his work. His face, that permanent smile etched into his features, betrayed no emotion. In the adjacent room, Lou, Caleb's younger brother, slept soundly, cocooned in the innocence of dreams. But the growing unease in the air stirred him. His breath quickened as an inexplicable sense of dread settled over him. The primal instinct to survive clawed its way into his consciousness. Lou's eyes fluttered open, and he was immediately met with the sight of Caleb standing above him. One pale hand pressed firmly over his mouth, the other holding the knife that caught a flicker of moonlight. Caleb's head tilted, the smile carved into his face unnervingly at odds with the whisper that escaped his lips. "Shoo," he murmured, his voice soft yet chillingly devoid of humanity. "Go back to sleep." Lou thrashed, but Caleb's grip was ironclad, his strength far surpassing anything human. The knife hovered, a glinting promise of death. But then, something flickered in Caleb's unblinking gaze. Was it hesitation? Recognition? Whatever it was, it passed as quickly as it came. Caleb released Lou and stepped back into the shadows, leaving the boy trembling, unsure if he had just been spared or sentenced to a fate worse than death. By dawn, the house was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirping of birds. The sun's rays crept through the windows, illuminating the blood-soaked remains of Marcus and Elena. Caleb moved through the house with eerie calm, his every motion deliberate as he packed a small bag with only the essentials. His expression never changed, that perpetual smile etched into his face as if mocking the horrors he had left behind. Willow Creek woke up to another day of serene perfection. Lawns were mowed, newspapers collected, and coffee brewed. But inside the Reynolds house, death lingered. It wasn't until mid-morning that the first signs of trouble were noticed, the newspaper left untouched on the doorstep, the curtains drawn tight when they were usually open to welcome the day. The neighbors grew concerned. A knock on the door went unanswered. Then another. Finally, someone called the police. When the officers arrived and entered the house, the scene they discovered would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, Caleb walked down a desolate highway, his bag slung over one shoulder. The town he had called home for such a brief time was behind him, its secrets left to fester. He didn't look back. There was no need. He knew the chaos he'd left in his wake would unravel Willow Creek's pristine facade. The whispers would start. The fear would spread. And soon, the darkness he carried would find another place to take root. He didn't have a destination in mind. It didn't matter. Every town had its secrets. Every community had its darkness. Caleb was simply there to expose it, to amplify it, to feed it. As he walked, the horizon stretched endlessly before him, the road bathed in the golden light of morning. His unblinking eyes took in the world around him, his carved smile never wavering. He was no longer bound by the rules of humanity, no longer constrained by morality or fear. Willow Creek was just the beginning. And nobody was safe.